Well, I will say a few words. I understand that I can repeat what I said before. I know that many of our experts, political scientists, participated in the preparation of this event and have already spoken today. But the falsification of history did not occur today. For many years, our non-voters have been engaged in this with the aim of defaming the Russian people and achieving their selfish interests, preventing cooperation in the post-Soviet space. These attempts to drive a wedge have become particularly active after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. This period is associated with a new surge of nationalist sentiments in Ukraine, which had existed there for a long time, but were subconsciously retained in a state of inactivity. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after a short period of time, then President Leonid Kuchma wrote a book in 2003. It was called Ukraine is Not Russia. The author of the book said that the goal of this work was to create Ukrainians. This concept was laid down in the book. Ukraine is not Russia became the intellectual foundation of the modern nationalist Ukrainian elite. In 2014, when there was an anti-communist coup, with the support of the United States and the European Union, Ukraine finally became a military political bridgehead to the west of our borders. In Odessa, monuments were demolished. The phenomenon of the demolition of monuments is, of course, very provocative not only for modern Ukrainian leaders, but also for the same Poles, the same Baltic states. The monument to the founder of Odessa, Empress Catherine the Great, was demolished. A week later, UNESCO decided that the historical center of Odessa is a world cultural heritage. It would be impossible to disgrace this respected organization, which is now headed by the General Director, Mrs. Azoulay. But I am not talking about other monuments. I am talking about the monuments to Alexander Suvorov, Alexander Pushkin, Joseph Babel, figures of literature, culture, art, whose name is associated with the Russian language. All these monuments are being demolished, as well as the monuments to those who liberated Ukraine from Nazi invaders. But it is clear that it is very difficult to replace the historical truth, so the ideologists of Ukraine, not Russia, are looking for such monuments. I am not joking, but in fact the Ukrainians dug up the Black Sea. The Buddha is from Zaporozhye. Mona Lisa is from Ukraine. Her great-grandparents were from Odessa and Kyiv. Can you imagine this nonsense? It is not just spread through the radio. It is from the textbooks on the history of Ukraine. And the Russophobia is deeply rooted there. It is actively supported by the West. And in the middle of the 19th century, for example, the authorities of the Austro-Hungarian Empire cultivated anti-Russian sentiments in Galicia, in the west of Ukraine. They began to actively persecute the inhabitants of this part of the territory. But a significant part of the Galician Russian intelligentsia and the vast majority of the people remained attached to the spiritual kinship with our country, despite all attempts to break these bonds. During the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian authorities launched large-scale repressions against the same Rusins. Tens of thousands were killed in the death camps of Tallerhof and Terezin, the first mass death camps. This is the Austro-Hungarian invention. And now the airport of the city of Graz in Austria is located in the place of Tallerhof. We have not forgotten these crimes. There is a work to recognize the destruction of the Russian population in Galicia, Russia, and other Russian regions of Austro-Hungary as the first genocide in the modern history of Europe. This work will definitely continue. In 1929, the most infamous organization of Ukrainian nationalists was created in Vienna. It became the matrix for most of the Ukrainian nationalist parties and organizations in the 1990s and 2000s. That is, in parallel with the ideological justification under the slogan of Ukraine is not Russia, the material embodiment of this nationalism, in fact, Nazism. In the image and likeness of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, the theory was promoted through this organization and through those who perceived it as the ideal unification of Ukrainians. The theory of ethnic purity, copying the experience of Western colonizers, as you know, and German Nazis. The peoples were divided into friendly, neutral, and they were to be evicted from the territory of Ukraine, and unfriendly on the other hand. The latter, and there were Russians, Poles, Jews, Hungarians, should be destroyed in the understanding of these Ukrainian nationalists. This is what they actually did in the years of World War. And this experience is now, or rather, those who were an ideologist and who embodied these hatred principles in life, now their new nationalist movement, or the revived nationalist movement, rises to the pedestal and glorifies Bandera, Shushkevich. They are declared as the founders of the modern Ukrainian nation. The Kyiv authorities consider themselves the heirs of these criminals, and it's not surprising that in the last 10 to 11 years, long before the start of the special military operation, the Kyiv junta began to exterminate everything that was somehow connected with Russia. The education, first the elementary school was banned in Russian, then the higher education, culture, mass media owned by Russian publishers were simply closed. They were evicted from Ukraine, and those Ukrainian mass media that were broadcast in Russian were also closed. But Ukraine now has such a filter organ, through which you need to coordinate any information for publication or for broadcast through any means of mass media, and you know, the president has long been paying attention to these trends, and he spoke 5-6 years ago at the session of the Organizing Committee of Victory in preparation for the next date of victory in the Great Patriotic War. And he touched on these things and said the following phrase: "Our answer to lies is the truth, and the truth, of course, we need to protect. It is that the South Russian lands and the entire territory of modern Ukraine have always been among the most developed, flourishing regions of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The heirs of these lands in the pre-Soviet and Soviet times invariably occupied high state posts, including the leader of the Soviet Union, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, who was born in the present-day Dnepropetrovsk region, worked for a very long time at the leading positions in Ukraine itself, and then, as you know, in Moscow. And at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic had the most powerful industrial potential and developed agriculture, which was brought about by the elites that came to power after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the murderous war that broke out in 2014 in Donbass. You can judge for yourself. The statistics are known. What the economy and social sphere of modern Ukraine is now. What orders there are, including the forceful hijacking of young people on the streets in order to first forcefully shove them into a car and then send them to the front. And Russia has nothing to do with it at all. Do you remember when the coup took place and the new authorities who came to Kyiv as a result of this coup shared their portfolios and announced their program? The State Department of the United States welcomed these events, and the notorious Victoria Nuland even proudly admitted that it was not in vain that the United States invested $5 billion in the creation, development, and strengthening of Ukrainian democracy. But you see, today there is a lot of talk about national identity, self-determination. The right of nations to self-determination is enshrined in the UN Charter. And I have repeatedly and publicly spoken in the Security Council, at the UN General Assembly, and in my talks with Antonio Guterres. I urge him not to forget that the Charter is not limited to one line. It is about territorial integrity. You know, Guterres' official representative, Dujarric, repeatedly leaves the answer to the question of the position of the UN on Ukrainian regulation. He repeatedly repeats, we are for the crisis to be regulated on the basis of international law, the principles of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the resolution of the General Assembly. As for the resolution of the General Assembly, he simply does not know that there are many resolutions, and one of the most important was adopted in 1970. It is a declaration on the principles of friendly relations between countries on the basis of the UN Charter. This is a large document. It was consensus, unlike those resolutions that the current Kyiv regime, with the support of the West, pushes by voting, and on which Guterres refers, justifying his position, which fully supports the Ukrainian regime. So, in the declaration that was adopted by the consensus, it is written that everyone should respect the territorial integrity of those states, whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, and because of this, represent all the population living on the corresponding territories. But neither Zelenskyy, nor those who came to power in 2014, neither Crimea, nor Donbass, nor Novorossiya. The first instinctive signal that was sent to the clean path of those who came to power in January 2014 was the announcement that they would cancel the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. After that, everything became crystal clear. And those who blindly and stubbornly repeat the slogan of territorial integrity forget a very simple thing, that it was the principle of self-determination of peoples that was at the heart of the decolonization process. When, in accordance with that declaration of 1970, the African peoples did not want to live under the colonial name but the colonizers, in Lisbon, Paris, London, in all the capitals of the metropolises, these governments did not represent the African peoples. And if this is so, then the process of decolonization was in full accordance with the UN Charter, and with the principles developed by the General Assembly from the point of view of the interconnection between the principles of the Charter. Just as I said, the current Ukrainian authorities do not represent the peoples of Crimea, Novorossiya, and Donbass. Moreover, we have distributed, if someone does not have these documents, we have distributed them more than once, documents that quote the statements of Ukrainian authorities regarding Russian and Russian-speaking citizens of their country, at least for a period long before the special military operation. Zelenskyy said, if you feel involved in Russian culture and live in Ukraine, my advice is to leave your children and grandchildren in Russia. And all the other officials from his cabinet spoke even more frankly, including the calls to kill Rusnia. And the sadly famous Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, he has now been expelled from there, and in 2022 he gave an interview, and in a live broadcast, answering the question of what tasks are before the Ukrainian authorities, he says, kill as many Russians as possible, because we want there to be no Russians at all, so we need to kill as many as possible so that our children have less work. And no complaints from a single Western state which supports this regime followed. Well, there are many examples from the modern history of Ukraine, which remain there simply thrown under the carpet, and no one is going to investigate the crime. In Odessa, on May 2, 2014, 100 living people were burned in the House of Trade Unions, only because they spoke out against what the corrupt, illegally seized authorities were doing. The Council of Europe, which is now actively preparing claims to the Russian Federation in connection with the events that they call aggression, occupation, annexation, the Council of Europe at that time robustly offered its services to assist in the investigation of this wild crime, as a result of which 100 people were burned alive, and even made some kind of resolution that he was ready to assist, and no one remembers about it anymore. Because the Kyiv authorities ignored the Council of Europe, pointed out its place in their understanding, and since then the Council of Europe has also been subordinate to the task of whitening the Kyiv criminals and blackening the activities of the Russian Federation. Although there is nothing to investigate, there are people who set fire and then shot at those who tried to escape by jumping out of the windows. They are all on video materials. There is absolutely no need to do any work. Just publish this data and that's it. Another episode of lies and cover-up is, of course, the April of 2022, when the Russian armed forces, at the request of the West, in anticipation of signing a peace agreement on the regulation based on the principles that the Ukrainians themselves proposed, and the West asked our leadership as a gesture of goodwill to withdraw the troops from Kyiv, which was done, including leaving the suburbs of Kyiv called Bucha, and 2 days after the mayor returned there, not somewhere in the basement, but on the central street of this settlement, the correspondents of the BBC, who were successfully caught, showed dozens of bodies of people, which were neatly laid out along this main street on both sides. There was an explosion of anger. The West again used this BBC report to introduce a new portion of sanctions against the Russian Federation. And since then we have been interested. Someone investigated this crime, wrote a letter to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He has been silent for many months, maybe more than a year. According to our data, they know everything perfectly well, but they are afraid to tell the truth, which is at least partially known to them. And the most illustrative example of hypocrisy and cover-up of criminals is the refusal to give the names of those people, whose bodies were shown and served as a reason for such a surge of indignation. There is no information. If someone after that says that Ukrainians are suffering and it is necessary to somehow force Russia, we cannot leave people under the rule of the regime that is now there. And if the so-called government, the so-called junta, if they expect that the ceasefire agreement will be reached in some way, and what will remain of Ukraine will live according to the laws they adopted, this is an illusion. This cannot be allowed under any circumstances. On the territory of Ukraine, which is outside the constitutional borders of the Russian Federation, millions of people speak Russian. It's native to them, and to leave them under the rule of a junta that has banned them, even speaking in Russian, only thinking that they have banned them, this will be a very big crime. I hope and I am sure that, well, we will definitely not allow this. I hope that the world community will not allow to mock the UN Charter in this way, where in the very first article it is written that everyone is obliged to respect human rights, regardless of race, sex, language, and religion. Both the Russian language and the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church are prohibited in Ukraine. Therefore, the simplest effort at this stage to regulate for those of our Western colleagues who are in a hurry, the simplest and absolutely flawless thing, is to demand that the laws directly violating the UN Charter be abolished, not to mention the numerous conventions upon the rights of national minorities. This would be a test of what the position of Europeans really is, not all, but most Europeans, under the leadership of London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and Warsaw, who have never spoken the words of human rights in relation to what is happening in Ukraine. When they discuss the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Venezuela, yes, almost any country, when they discuss and build some relations with it, there will definitely be moral teachings on the need to respect human rights. But there is no other country. We recalled with the ambassador of Israel that neither the Arabic language is prohibited in Israel, nor the Hebrew language is prohibited in the Arab countries. There's nowhere else like this. But everything is possible in Ukraine. Moreover, they do not just close their eyes, but speak with pride. Both Ursula von der Leyen and, before his resignation, Mr. Michel, all the officials in Brussels, defending their position on Ukraine, convincing their voters that they need to tighten their belts and wait for better times, because now they need to help Ukraine, not to medicine, not to heating. And they say we need to wait because Ukraine defends European values. So draw conclusions. What does Europe see in its values? The most real Nazism is being reborn. And there are many examples of this, including the speech of the new Chancellor of the Russian Federation, Mr. Merz, that it is time for Germany to lead Europe again. Such words to say, but you have to be a very big cynic. The militarization of Europe is proclaimed as one of the main tasks for the second half of the decade. This is a very dangerous trend. I will not go further. I can talk for a long time on this topic. It worries me. But let's move on to the questions.
We read every day about the massive proposals that come, well, pseudo-proposals from our opponents, and proposals from our friends, including India, China, Brazil, and their views on how to come to some kind of solution or settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. I would like to ask, in your position, what is the fundamental difference between these proposals and our current one? You have partially already answered this question. You have characterized the Kyiv regime and its current state. It is very difficult to reach an agreement with them, if at all possible. But nevertheless, negotiations began.
It is difficult. We agreed in February. In the end of February, when the Ukrainians, in 1922, after the beginning of the special military operation, when the Ukrainians asked for negotiations, we immediately agreed. There were several rounds in Belarus, and then we moved to Istanbul. It was already the end of March, the beginning of April, and it was the Ukrainians. President Putin has talked about this many times, even showed papers. It was the Ukrainians who proposed to adjust the situation based on the principles they had written. The refusal to join NATO and any other military blocs, the the refusal to deploy military bases on their territory. After all, the plans of the British were to create bases in Ochakov and the Sea of Azov. All this was documented. They had been looking at Crimea for a long time, until 2014. There were no military bases, no military exercises on the territory of Ukraine. And the security guarantees, which they themselves asked for, were provided by 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Germany, Turkey, and a list of those who wanted to join. And the guarantees were formulated almost in the same way as the 5th article of the North Atlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty, and it was emphasized that these guarantees would not be distributed to Crimea and the territory of Donbass. They wrote these principles and that the dialogue would be continued in other directions. And we agreed. It was important in order to ensure the main goal at that time, which was the inability of NATO to penetrate the territory of Ukraine, and other guarantees were provided there, including for national minorities. And all this was overthrown. The President has returned to this topic more than once. But in recent years, up to this day, we have always emphasized at the highest level, at other levels, that we are ready for negotiations, for peaceful negotiations, which will be devoted to understanding and eliminating the root causes of this crisis. It was not us who refused contacts. Zelensky said that he would never sit next to Putin. He signed a decree prohibiting negotiations with Putin and his government. Now they are trying to win him over, saying that this is not the case, that you cannot meet with Putin personally. And if you cannot meet with Putin, then why did you shout that you went to Istanbul and Putin did not want to come there? If you compare the arguments that are being voiced in Ukraine, it is obvious that this is an inadequate leader, and it is very difficult to understand when and what he will do, when he will fly to the South African Republic, when he will go to Europe to hug someone. But the President very clearly laid out our assessment of the legitimacy, the degree of legitimacy of Zelensky and his regime. But he emphasized that we still do not refuse contacts with him and his administration in order to agree on all the principles of regulation. On the other hand, when it comes to signing, the issue of legitimacy will be of decisive importance, because if they sign those whose legitimacy, to put it mildly, does not convince anyone, then the negotiators may question the agreement reached. But look at how the position of both the Ukrainians themselves and the Ukrainian and Western leadership has changed. Until recently, well, a year ago, probably, they declared no negotiations, no truce, and only a strategic defeat of Russia will save the situation on the battlefield, and Russia must withdraw from the border since 1991. And then, when they began to understand that the change in the situation on the line of contact was far from in favor of the Kyiv regime, they began to make new notes again against the cessation of hostilities and against the start of negotiations, because, as they all declared, for the start of negotiations, Ukraine must provide itself with a position of power. And we are talking about the position of power in Russia. We are talking about history. Who does it teach from these people? And let them remember how their ancestors, forefathers tried to talk to Russia from the position of power. But it is useless. And now it is they who are asking for a break just to pump up their weapons again. They said so publicly. My former colleague, now the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, said that Putin must immediately agree to a truce.
We read every day about the massive proposals that come, well, pseudo-proposals from our opponents, and proposals from our friends, including India, China, Brazil, and their views on how to come to some kind of solution or settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. I would like to ask, in your position, what is the fundamental difference between these proposals and our current one? You have partially already answered this question. You have characterized the Kyiv regime and its current state. It is very difficult to reach an agreement with them, if at all possible. But nevertheless, negotiations began.
It is difficult. We agreed in February. In the end of February, when the Ukrainians, in 1922, after the beginning of the special military operation, when the Ukrainians asked for negotiations, we immediately agreed. There were several rounds in Belarus, and then we moved to Istanbul. It was already the end of March, the beginning of April, and it was the Ukrainians. President Putin has talked about this many times, even showed papers. It was the Ukrainians who proposed to adjust the situation based on the principles they had written. The refusal to join NATO and any other military blocs, the refusal to deploy military bases on their territory. After all, the plans of the British were to create bases in Ochakov and the Sea of Azov. All this was documented. They had been looking at Crimea for a long time, until 2014. There were no military bases, no military exercises on the territory of Ukraine. And the security guarantees, which they themselves asked for, were provided by 5 permanent members.
But the work on the memorandum is underway today, right?
Yes, it is underway. I don't know about the other side, but our work is already in the advanced stage. In any case, we will pass this memorandum to the Ukrainians, as agreed, and we will count on what they will do. I don't know about the other side, but our work is already in the advanced stage. In any case, we will pass this memorandum to the Ukrainians, as agreed, and we will count on what they will do. In any case, we will pass this memorandum to the Ukrainians, as agreed, and we will count on what they will do.
Is anything clear about the deadlines for the next meetings? Because there is a lot of talk about this now.
No, the deadlines have not yet been determined. Many people fantasize about when and where it will take place. We do not have any ideas at the moment. But, to be honest, we probably have a papal nuncio here, don't we? No? It seemed to me.
It was now when the registration was going.
Nevertheless, I just want to say that we should not waste our own abilities on elaborating options that are not very realistic. Because, well, imagine the Vatican as a place for negotiations. This is a bit inelegant, I would say. When Orthodox countries will be on the Catholic platform to discuss issues related to the elimination of the first reason. One of the first reasons is the course to the destruction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Instead, when Poroshenko was president, he asked the Patriarch of Constantinople and Istanbul, Thomas, to create an alternative church, which became famous, first of all, for the fact that its executioners seized the power of the church, the canonical church, kill or beat up the priests. There is also the Greco-Union Church in Ukraine, which is also very, very active. These are Catholics. They are very active in supporting the regime established in Ukraine after the coup d'etat. I think it will not be very comfortable for the Vatican itself to accept delegations of two Orthodox countries in these conditions.
Mr. President, if we think about the future, this year we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Agreement. It is clear that this is a very important decision. The Helsinki Agreement was adopted, which ensured peace and stability in Europe for a long time. But then there were events that seriously undermined these agreements. I mean the events in the Balkans, the events in Estonia, the South Caucasus, and so on. Our leadership and President Putin at different stages have repeatedly spoken about the need to create a new European security architecture that would meet the realities of today and would ensure peace and stability in Europe for a long period of time, at least for one generation, or better yet, for several generations. Do you think it is possible to talk about efforts in this direction today? And is Europe ready to deal with these issues? Or does the current situation allow us to shift this perspective to a rather distant period?
Or does the current situation allow us to shift this perspective to a rather distant period? Europe is in a deep crisis of security. And Europe, as I have already said, is thinking about militarization. And I would like to stress once again that it is very alarming that Germany is leading in these discussions. In particular, Chancellor Merz gave a speech 2 weeks ago, or even less, a week and a half ago in the Bundestag. And I quote, "The strengthening of the Bundeswehr is paramount for us. In the future, the Federal Republic of Germany will provide all the financial resources necessary for the Bundeswehr in order to become the strongest conventional army in Europe." Does this remind you of anything else? Hitler was the strongest conventional army in Europe at the time. And another very interesting point from Merz's speech. He recently said that Russia will not stop in Ukraine, justifying its course to militarization and the creation of the strongest army. He said that Russia will not stop in Ukraine and will go to conquer Europe. According to Freud, he would do so because he does not need to protect his compatriots, but to capture the land and start exploiting it. These Nazi instincts turned out to be very tenacious. As for our position, it is clear that the Euro-Atlantic security models have not been justified. This is true, first of all, of the OSCE. We also see a deep crisis in NATO as the main North Atlantic structure of the West. The European Union, having signed an agreement with NATO about a year and a half or 2 years ago, has practically become a pawn in the military-political sense, because this agreement gives NATO the right to use the territory of all non-NATO states when it is necessary to transfer arms and equipment to the east, that is, closer to us. I think I have already talked about this. In Eurasia, this is the largest, richest, and most diverse continent. It is the home of many great civilizations and a continent with many integration structures. But there has never been a continental umbrella structure. There are also many integration unions in Africa, in Latin America, but there is the African Union, there is CELAC, a community of Latin American and Caribbean countries. And in Eurasia, there is no such comprehensive organization or even a union of movements. It is not necessary to make an organization, which is probably unnatural. And going from life, we see prospects, including in terms of increasing the competitiveness of Eurasian countries. We see prospects for establishing working relations between existing integration unions. The Eurasian Economic Union has relations with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and ASEAN. ASEAN has relations with the Shanghai Organization, and so on. And there is an initiative of Kazakhstan, which we support, a meeting on the interaction and peace of trust in Asia, which is now being discussed about transforming it into an organization. There is the Council of Cooperation of the Arab States of the Persian Gulf. This is also a very promising union. And considering the process of normalization of relations between the Arab monarchies and Iran, this seriously increases the economic, transit, logistical potential. There is the Central Asian Five, with which many countries of the continent, and not only the continent, establish relations. And all this, if each of these unions has its own plans for the development of transport routes, delivery routes of energy carriers, and of course, it is much more profitable, more effective to harmonize these plans and not to engage in the same things on each side. And the president, quite a long time ago, at the first summit of Russia-ASEAN, formulated his vision of establishing relations, going from life between all these existing structures, and assumed that the result of this process would be the formation of a large Eurasian partnership. And the process is underway. And the same corridors, international transport corridors, north-south, which provide direct connection between, say, the Baltic and Indian Oceans. And there are other ideas. I was in Armenia yesterday, and the Armenian side is working on the initiative of the world's crossroads, striving to build its own territory, its own logistical capabilities into these large continental processes. And if we are talking about this, then we are for all infrastructure projects to develop, so that, as our Chinese friends say, thousands and millions of flowers bloom. But in order to implement the world's crossroads in practice, it is necessary to sign a peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We sincerely wish success in this. Literally yesterday we discussed this with the Prime Minister and the President of Armenia. And it is clear that the treaty became possible thanks to several trilateral summits of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And we are ready to continue to provide assistance if both sides are interested in this. And of course, there is a need for normalization between Armenia and the Turkish Republic. Overcoming the conflicts and unblocking the prohibitions on transport and economic ties will significantly increase the competitiveness of this part of the continent and the entire continent. Well, a large Eurasian partnership, as we see it, would become a serious material foundation for efforts and work on the formation of Eurasian architecture and security. I would say that this should be done by the countries of the continent, and that there should be a structure in the logic of Eurasian security, not Euro-Atlantic. Not because we want to distance ourselves, but there are NATO countries that are interested in being organizedly intertwined with North America. Well, they have such opportunities, please. But there is no need to make this an obstacle for other countries, or rather to create an obstacle for the creation of a structure where all countries of Eurasia can and will have the right to enter, including the western part of our continent. I do not see any reason to consider this to be a conspiracy, but there are attempts to engage in one-sided initiatives from the other side, from the side of NATO. Do you remember General Secretary of NATO Stoltenberg? Many people have already forgotten about him, but he was the head of the Secretariat of the North Atlantic Alliance for a long time. And in his last year in this position, when NATO was already actively promoting Indo-Pacific strategies, Stoltenberg was asked by journalists, as NATO has always said, this is a defensive alliance, and the task of this alliance is to protect the territory of its member states from external threats. He did not even blink, did not blush, said, yes, this is how it is. But now threats to the territories of NATO member states come from Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea. That's what he said. And the fact that NATO is now moving its infrastructure to the eastern part of the Eurasian continent, the fact that NATO is actively trying to, well, to weaken at least, to weaken the unity of the ASEAN, is trying to call on individual members of the ASEAN to join closed bloc structures, sometimes trio, sometimes four, and declares that this is a vital region for NATO. Why is the Euro-Atlantic structure making plans to subjugate itself, to spread its influence almost to the entire Eurasian continent, all the way to the Far East? If the countries of Eurasia themselves will not engage in issues of architecture and security, then it remains only to observe how they will engage in this from the ocean. Another aspect of this problem, of course, is that President Trump, as I have already said, insists that his foreign policy is based on national interests. He believes that European problems should at least be dealt with more by the Europeans than by the United States. This is also a tendency for Eurasianism to be somehow identified in the prospects of discussions on how to ensure security. This is contradicted, as I have already said, by the completely aggressive revanchist rhetoric of Brussels and Berlin on the militarization of Europe and the processing of its population to prepare for the war with Russia. This should be opposed by peaceful efforts. And here we actively supported, from the very beginning, the initiative of Belarus, which held a conference on Eurasian security. Last year, there was a second conference. This autumn, a third conference is planned. After the second conference, and I will certainly participate in both, my colleague and I, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belarus, Rozhenkov, shared our vision of the document that we conventionally call the Eurasian map of multipolarity and diversity. By the way, some ministers from the European Union and other European countries, Serbia in particular, emphasized that Eurasian discussions on Eurasian security should be open to all countries on the Eurasian continent. But this is still in the process. As I have already said, we are not trying to artificially, schematically draw the Eurasian map. This is what distinguishes us from the authors and guides of Indo-Pacific strategies, which were conceived in NATO cabinets and then began to advance in NATO. Then they were supported. In fact, we are trying to catch the practical trends in real life. As I have already said, they are primarily in the fact that numerous structures on the Eurasian continent are interested in building bridges and in using them to implement mutually beneficial projects.
It is quite clear that the priorities of the Eurasian continent, including those related to security, must say that today experts have become active in dealing with these issues. We will have a separate session dedicated to the Eurasian continent and Eurasian security in the coming days. But you have just mentioned the United States and Trump. If we talk about the Russian-American relationship, and to be a little abstract, Ukraine is not the only country on the agenda. What is the situation in addition to the Ukraine crisis?
It is a return to normalcy. When Yuri Mushakov and I met in Arliata with Marco Rubio and Michael Wolfson, we clearly understood that the national interests should be at the heart of foreign policy. This is President Trump's position. This is President Putin's position. There are no ideological considerations when it comes to national interests. I hope Marco Rubio will not be offended if we take national interests as a basis. He just said that we respect the fact that each country has its own national interests, especially when it comes to great powers. This leads to two conclusions. The first is that the national interests of any two countries, especially of two large and great powers, will never coincide. Moreover, in most cases, they will not coincide. But when they do coincide, it will be a huge mistake not to use this coincidence in order to turn the situation into a model of joint, mutually beneficial projects in the sphere of economy, technology, and so on. The second conclusion is that when these interests do not coincide, the responsibility mangled powers is not to allow this collision to turn into a confrontation, especially a hot confrontation. This was the theme of our talks in Riyadh. I feel that at this stage, this is how Trump's administration works. We have always acted this way. We have never taught anyone a lesson. This is a significant change in Washington's policy compared to the Democratic administrations, although we see that this line of the White House has caused a serious upheaval among the elites, including the Republican elites. Many people are not used to living in such a way as not to be involved in everything and not to define everything. But we are, of course, sober people in a political sense. It is very important here not to be deceived by illusions. It is important to be realistic, to understand that there have been many situations when the United States changed its position radically. This is life. But we must take this into account, and of course, we are taking this into account while planning our steps. But on the other hand, we are ready to implement mutually beneficial projects. This includes space, high-tech, energy, of course. We have American companies, and all this is possible if the American partners are ready to agree on such principles that will ensure equality and mutual benefit.
Returning to the Ukrainian crisis, how do you think it has influenced and still influences the formation of a new world order? What irreversible changes have taken place? How favorable or unfavorable are these changes for our fatherland, for Russia?
I believe that the trend is healthy. The trend is the formation of a multipolar world and the formation of a new world order. Many people consider this to be an unnecessary dream because even large countries, especially the global majority, do not want to quarrel with the United States. We do not want to quarrel with anyone at all, but we want to work honestly. I would like to stress once again what I said to this audience when we met in Ukraine. We do not consider it necessary to break the international legal foundation of the world order in the form of the UN Charter. We simply need to respect it and respect the principles contained there in all their entirety. For example, when it was necessary to destroy the remnants of Yugoslavia, the West declared Kosovo's independence unilaterally and said that it was the right of the nation to self-determination. However, by that time, no one had even used force, and the UN Security Council Resolution 1244 was in force. It was in 2008, 6 years later, after the bloody coup in Ukraine, the junta, which came to power, launched direct hostilities against its own people because they refused to acknowledge the results of the coup in Crimea and in Donbass. When Lugansk was bombed from the air, no one cared about it. The people were torn to shreds. When the Crimeans, in the face of the so-called friendly trains of armed bandits to capture the Crimean parliament, rebelled against it and held a referendum, the West said it was impossible because it was a violation of territorial integrity. What about Serbia? It was different. After that, the Serbs turned to the International Court and decided that the declaration of independence by a part of a state did not require the consent of the central authorities. Everything seemed to be clear, but no one wanted to acknowledge it. And when Europe, despite everything that has been known for a long time, despite the fact that the United States looks realistically at Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine, Trump was the first, if not the only one, to publicly say that it was a grave mistake to bring Ukraine into NATO. And this will never happen. And this is the fault of the Biden administration. And Europe, despite everything, already publicly says that the territorial issue is inevitable. It will have to be resolved. It will have to come out of reality, and so on. And Europe is stubbornly repeating that the Russians should go to the borders of 1991. I have already said that when this conflict is over, and I hope it will be so, what will be the order that will remain behind the constitutional borders of the Russian Federation? That the Zelenskyy regime will remain there, and that all Russians will be persecuted in violation of all norms of international law. And Europe, when it calls to return to the borders of 1991, what does it want? To give the Crimeans, Novorossians, Donbassians to this regime. They do not demand to change the Ukrainian laws there. They say that these laws protect European values. So I do not think that this is an easy job. The memorandum that we agreed to prepare and pass on to the Ukrainians, we will make it based on the most fundamental things, based on what is the primary reason for this conflict, and how these primary reasons should be eliminated.
Do we have a chance to ask a couple of questions?
Коллеги, есть возможность задать пару вопросов? Есть желающие это сделать?
I am not a diplomat. I am a member of the CIA. First of all, I would like to thank you for the position that we will not move away from the solution of the primary causes of the Ukrainian crisis, for the fact that the Foreign Ministry is considering the issue of the recognition of the Russian Galician Russian telegraphy. I wrote a whole collection of proverbs where all this is considered in detail. And I propose for the Foreign Ministry such an important document as the message of the Holy Patriarch that the Russian Church cannot recognize the world in which Kyiv, the mother of Russian citizens, and other Russian lands are always separated from Russia. I want to pass it on to you so that you can use it in your work. And, in fact, I have no such questions. There are words of support and full support for your position. Thank you.
Colleagues, I have a question. I would like to ask a personal question. As a minister, what lessons have you learned about the current situation? I know that the foreign ministry is very serious about these issues. I think it will be interesting for the audience.
What conclusions?
Yes, what conclusions for myself for the foreign ministry?
With each passing day of work, especially in recent years in the Ukrainian direction, I am convinced again and again that we are doing the right thing.
A good answer and a short one.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank Anatoly Vasilyevich and the leadership of the Diplomatic Academy for the traditional events for the Diplomatic Corps in Moscow. We will continue this tradition, and I hope you find it interesting and useful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good luck.